Hi, welcome back to Coding Games in Python. In this video, we'll talk about the SpriteList class. When we have a collection of related sprites, for example, wall obstacles, we might want to store them in a list. Arcade has a class that can allow us to work with a list of sprites called SpriteLists. And it's highly recommended that you use SpriteLists instead of Python's list. And the reason is because SpriteLists has been optimized for drawing sprites using OpenGL. And it's super fast to draw sprite using the list. So typically we divide sprites into different sprite groups or sprite layers in a game to kind of allow us to manage the sprites better. For example, if you have background sprites like walls, things that don't move, we might want to group them into one sprite list. If you have a bunch of enemy sprites, we might want to put them into another sprite list, etc. So drawing sprite with SpriteList is very fast. For example, if you have a sprite list of hundreds of thousands of sprites, Arcade can still draw all of those sprites, keeping the 60 frames per second frame rate. And because of performance, every sprite should be in some sprite list, even if the sprite list has only one element. For example, if you have a player object and there's only one player, it's still good to put into a sprite list. Okay, so the SpriteList class is very simple. The constructor that has no argument will initialize an empty sprite list. A lot of these, this is very similar to a regular list in Python. You have the pen method, which allows us to add a sprite object onto the list. And a sprite can belong to multiple sprite lists. So this is kind of confusing, but so suppose you have a coin sprite object and player is walking around collecting the coin object. This coin object can be a member of the all sprites list, list of all the sprites in the game, so that if you want to draw them, we can just call draw on this list. But it also can be a member of the coin list, allow us to kind of manage collision and player picking up objects, things like that. And so it's possible for a sprite to be in multiple lists. And it turns out that every sprite object has a record of all the lists that you belong to. And so this is really important later. And so there's a remove method from the SpriteList class. Allows us to remove a sprite from a sprite list. And but typically, again, because a sprite can belong to many sprite lists, when we remove a sprite, we might want to remove it from all the lists. For example, if someone pick up a coin object, then that coin object should be removed from all the lists that contain it. And so instead of calling the remove method, which only remove the sprite from this one list, we want to remove it from all lists. And so there's a method called kill that this method is from the Sprite class that allow us to remove it from all lists. And so if I call coin.kill, then the coin sprite object will be removed from all lists that contain it. The draw method from the sprite list allows us to draw all the sprites in the sprite list. Again, I just want to say that this draw method is optimized for drawing sprite, and so we want to use it whenever we draw any sprite. And then finally, the update method updates the movement of all the sprite in the sprite list. This update method is very similar to the update method from the sprite object, which allows us to move a sprite. In fact, this update method simply is a for loop that calls the update method from the sprite object that we saw in the previous lecture. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the kill method, again, this is also from the sprite class, allows us to remove this sprite from all sprite lists containing it. Okay, let's and by the way, this method does not delete the sprite itself. So remove from all sprite lists, but the actual sprite is still available. Okay, let's look at some code example. Okay, so this is the same template as I've been using in the last few videos. Let's load up some images. By the way, this has the main.py file and then an images folder. In the images folder, there's a couple of images. A star image that we saw last lecture, and then also a tank image. So for example, let me load up the tank image. So let's create a tank image, and we're gonna say arcade.sprite, and the name is the location images, and then it's gonna be tank.png. And then so again, as I mentioned before, everything should belong to a sprite list. So let's create a list that will contain this tank. So I'll call this tank list. So you have a lot of tanks you can put into this list, but even if not, you should always have everything in a list. So let's create an empty list. So SpriteList, and then we're gonna take this tank list and add to it the tank that we just created. So now that's in the list, we can draw that that tank. Again, we're gonna do it through the list instead to make it faster. So we're gonna call the list, and then we're gonna just simply call the draw method. So that would draw the list of tank, but in this case it's only one tank. Okay, let's see if we can just run this real quick. Okay, so there's the tank at the bottom left. By the way, I also have some code here from the previous video that allowed me to move and control this tank on key press and on key release. So the code is the same as before. So let me show you that. So if I move the tank, let me double check here. I need to update it. So I'm moving it, but I'm not updating it. So on update, I want to say self.tanklist, and I want to update it. So again, I could have called self.tank and call the update method, but let's just go through the list. So now I can move my tank on the screen. By the way, notice this is facing down, so if I don't want to face down, say I want to have the game going left to right, I can use the angle attribute that we just saw and change that. So when I created the tank sprite, I could have also initialized the angle. Let's make it 90 degrees. So this is measured in degrees, and it will be rotated counterclockwise 90 degrees. So if I were to run this, then notice my tank is now facing to the right. Oh, sorry. So self.tank.angle. There it is. So here's my tank facing to the right. Okay, I'm going to create so as I mentioned earlier, we have a star image. So I'm going to create a bunch of stars and put it on the screen. So let's do a for loop. And let's start from 100 pixel, go all the way down to the width of the screen, and we'll go by increment of say 200. So we go every 200 pixel, we're gonna put a star on the screen. So I'll create a star by creating a sprite image out of it. So this is images star.png, and then I'm gonna put the center of this sprite at center X will be at I. That's just the I position, and then the Y position, let's make it be a constant, say 500. And then I'm going to take this sprite, I'm going to add it to my well, actually let me create another list. So this is the star list. So here's a new empty list. I'm gonna append this object onto this list. So I'm gonna call the append method to add the star object that we just created into this star list. So all these stars will be in the same star list. Okay, so I create a bunch of star objects and then put it into a list. So now I need to make sure I draw it. So star list dot draw to draw all of them, and then these star will be static, it won't move. So we don't have to really do this, but if we want to be more explicit, We can also call the update on all the stars, but because change x, change y is 0, this update will not move the star. Okay, so let's run this. Now notice we have a bunch of star objects. By the way, we can also scale the star if it's too big. So for example, I could have come back here and put in 0.8 to scale it down a little bit, so that's not so big. There we go. Okay, so now we can work with sprites, we can work with SpriteLists, and then the next few videos will focus on some collisions, so that if we want to, for example, collect the stars. Okay, I think that's all I want to talk about in this video. Thanks for watching.